Hello and welcome to another Canguro English Daily Digest. My name is Christian and today is Tuesday, the best day of the week. Now, in the previous Daily Digest, I talked a lot about the philosophy of language and about the way that humans and animals communicate, and also maybe some alien and strange languages. And I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about that today, but with a more kind of practical focus. Now, yesterday I kind of focused on how languages and non-human languages, like animal languages, can use sound in different ways. And I got a lot of messages from people saying, well, you know, sound is not the only way that we can communicate. And those people are absolutely right. I mean, look at the way that I'm communicating with you right now, using gestures and facial expressions. All of those things are completely non-verbal communication, and they're really important. And, you know, scientists have done some thinking about how aliens might communicate in other kind of non-verbal ways, like they could communicate using gestures, right? Or they could communicate using sound that we cannot even perceive, like ultrasonic or subsonic sound. They could communicate using light, like ultraviolet light that we cannot even perceive. And there are other possibilities of ways of communication, like maybe emitting chemicals that we cannot even comprehend. And it's possible that if an alien, you know, an extraterrestrial alien came to Earth, that we wouldn't be able to communicate with them because we can't even perceive their output. It's beyond human comprehension. But one kind of important non-verbal type of communication that we have here on Earth, of course, is sign language. And sign language is spoken by thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people all over the world. And it's a very rich and, you know, really interesting communication system that's capable of producing all of the richness of spoken language. And I have this really super interesting paper here. Language without speech, segregating distinct circuits in the human brain. Okay? And this was the question. The question of whether language is processed independently of speech, however, is still heavily discussed. But what they showed in this paper is that when people use and comprehend sign language, it lights up exactly the same parts of the brain as spoken language. And again, this is more evidence that the form of communication is not important for the brain, right? Whether you're telling me, you know, that you love me using sign language, or whether you're telling me you love me, it doesn't make any difference. My brain doesn't care. I was watching an interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger yesterday, and in the interview they asked him, should you use dumbbells or kettlebells, right? So dumbbells are those traditional kind of like a weight, you know, with the round things on the end, you know, right? And a kettlebell is like a big ball with a handle, right? And so he asked him, should people use dumbbells or kettlebells? And his answer was, it doesn't make any difference because the muscle doesn't see what you're holding in your hand. And it seems obvious, right? It's such an obvious answer. And it's the same with language. your brain doesn't see the language, your brain sees the message, sees the concepts, right? And this is evidence of that. Our brains process language without speech. And here's some more evidence, okay, from neuroscience. The representation of semantic information across human cerebral cortex during listening versus reading is invariant to stimulus modality. Basically, listen to this. Here we show that although the representation of semantic information in the human brain is quite complex, the semantic representations evoked by listening versus reading are almost identical. So basically, your brain doesn't care whether you're reading something or listening to it. It's all the same to your brain. It just wants the message. It's more evidence that a really important part of learning a language is focusing on having something to say, focusing on, having a message, ideas, concepts. Now I want to sort of just go a little bit back, and let's talk a bit more about this idea that your language is a part of your culture, okay? That culture and language are strongly connected. Because in the previous digest, I said that two important things when you're learning a language. One is you need to focus on having ideas and thinking, and you also need to focus on culture, because culture will really help you to learn a language. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, okay? Because there was this really famous study that was never fully published, okay, by Boroditsky and her colleagues, okay? And what they did was they took German speakers and Spanish speakers and they created a list of words that were feminine and masculine in Spanish and feminine and masculine in German. So, English is a genderless language. We don't have gendered nouns. Like, for me as a native English speaker, this is a pen. It's not el pen or la pen. It's not masculine or feminine, okay? It's just a pen. Something important to notice, right, is that there's this idea, right? This idea that there's a strong connection between masculine and feminine language and masculine and feminine human gender. As in, the reason that things in German are masculine and feminine is because that reflects this kind of human experience. But that's not actually true. Grammatical gender is not related to biological gender. Gender can exist in languages in lots of different ways. You can have masculine and feminine, and also neuter, no gender, like in German. You can have an animate and inanimate gendered language, where the things you're talking about depend on whether the thing is alive or dead, and lots of other different ways that you can gender language. Okay, it's not about biology. But it does raise a question. It raises an interesting question. And this is the question that Boroditsky and her colleagues tried to answer. The question was, if I'm a Spanish person and, this object is feminine in the language, do I subconsciously think of it as feminine in reality? And what about this? If this is a masculine in my language, a masculine thing, do I think about it as a kind of having masculine qualities, right? So this is what they did. Listen to this. Where is it? Okay, so they created a list of 24 object names that had opposite grammatical genders in Spanish and German. So, for example, the pen was masculine in German, but feminine in Spanish, and the telephone was feminine in German and masculine. They were opposite genders, right? And then they asked a group of native Spanish speakers and native German speakers to write down the first 3 adjectives that came to mind. So, I could say, right, here's this pen. Write down the first 3 adjectives that you think of. Go. Here's a telephone. Write down the first 3 adjectives you think of. Go. And then they wanted to know, would they write down masculine or feminine adjectives? And listen to this. As predicted, Spanish and German speakers generated adjectives that were rated more masculine for items whose names were grammatically masculine in their native language than for items whose names were grammatically feminine. For example, what does it say here? For the German word key, which is masculine in German, they wrote hard, heavy, jagged, metal, serrated, and useful, right? Whereas in Spanish, where the key is feminine, they wrote golden, intricate, little, lovely, shiny, and tiny. Right? Fascinating stuff. Blows your mind, right? But here's the thing, okay? 2 things. The first thing is that this study was never fully published. And the second thing is that this group here, Ann Micken, Marin Shifke, and Anatol Stefanovic, they tried to replicate the experiment in 2 ways, and they found no correlation between grammatical gender and this biological gender. They couldn't replicate the experiment. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Now, when I read you the characteristics, when I said that a key is hard and heavy and jagged, apparently those are masculine qualities, whereas golden and intricate and lit and lovely are feminine qualities. Well, says who? And this is where culture and language and the question of learning language comes into play, okay? Because the idea that men are hard and heavy, well, that's a cultural thing. And the idea that, females are intricate and little, well, again, they are cultural constructs. There are other languages in the world where women would be the hard and the heavy ones, and the men would be the little, intricate, golden, lovely things. Think about it. Think about why men are hard. It's a product of our culture. Why are women golden? Product of our culture. So really, in a way, the experiment is kind of meaningless because it has no objective reference, right? And this brings us to ask the question, okay, so why do we need to learn culture with language? Because you could go and study English and never watch an English television program, never read an English book, never travel to England or any other English-speaking country. You could never have any culture. Why should we do it? Why is it necessary to incorporate culture into language learning? And to kind of answer this question, I'm going to use 2 examples, and one of them is the Rastafaris. Now, Rastafaris are an extremely interesting group of people, in my humble opinion. Really interesting. And one of the reasons they're interesting is because they have a special way of speaking. It's a kind of modified version of English called Ayaric, also called Livalect, Dread Talk, or I Talk. Okay? And so it's a kind of modified version of English. And one of the really interesting modifications is this. So instead of saying me, they always say I. So you know that in English, I is the subject pronoun and me is the object pronoun. Like, for example, I gave the book to him, right? I gave the book to him. He gave the book to me. But a Rastafari would not ever say me. And the reason is, listen to this. Me is felt to turn the person into an object, whereas I emphasizes the subjectivity of the individual. So basically they have eliminated the word me from English grammar because they do not want to be objectified. So they say, he gave I the book. And this also, they have a phrase called I and I. I and I is a complex term referring to the oneness of God and every human being. So I and I, it's like you're sort of, this phrase may be a word that unites you with the entire universe. Now, let's think about the possible effect that this could have on your perception of the world if you never say me. Maybe it could have no effect. Maybe the effect would be completely null, right? But maybe not, right? I mean, this idea, this deeply embedded idea that you are not an object, that you are I, you're a subject, that you are at one with the universe, and that becomes part of the way that you speak. It's a powerful idea that could change the way that you view the world. And you will never be fluent in Ayaric. You will never understand the language, the point of view, the perspective of a Rastafarian without understanding what it means to never say me. And finally, I want to talk about something a lot more practical. And this is a study which came out on July the 1st this year, okay? Language influences mass opinion towards gender and LGBT equality, okay? So you know that discrimination against LGBT people and basically gender inequality is a big issue right now in society. And these scientists, they proved that by using gender-neutral language, it affects the way that people treat LGBT people and, people who are gender fluid or non-binary, whatever, okay? And you will find this, if you think about it, it's obvious, right? Like, the way that in the workplace, for example, it's not acceptable to use sexist language. A very small change, for example, is the way that in English we had Mr. and Mrs. and Miss. Mrs. and Miss were to, indicate married and unmarried women. Well, now in 2019, you aren't defined by your marriage status. We have Ms. And that little change affected the way that we think. So maybe we will never communicate with aliens or understand what it's like to think like an alien, but Small language changes can have a huge effect. I'm Christian, this is Canguro English. I'll see you in class.